Sometime in the next 2 to 3 years, possibly even this fiscal year, something extraordinary will happen. For the first time since at least the completion of the Terbela Dam in 1976, a majority of Pakistan's electricity generation will come from imported primary fuel sources rather than domestic ones. Needless to say, this has profound implications for the cost of energy in the country and the government's management of the economy. But there is still a bigger issue at play here. The next decade will be a highly volatile one for Pakistan when it comes to electricity prices. If we are very lucky, global energy prices for oil and gas will remain relatively low, ideally below $60 a barrel for crude oil, and thus we might be able to skate through this period relatively unscathed. But to be reliant on a full decade of low energy prices is a very bad place to be as a country, especially one whose public is used to cheap domestic sources of energy. This story will explain 3 questions. How do we get here? What is the outlook for the next decade? And what can be done to ensure that we get out of this situation? Farooq Tirmizi explores what could possibly be the end of cheap energy. Rarely for Pakistan, this also appears to be one area where the government and private sector appear to be on track to solve the problem provided we do not veer off track. Both the current Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf-led administration and its predecessor Pakistan Muslim League Nawaz-led administration have put in place both policies and projects that appear to be on track to result in Pakistan's energy mix getting both cleaner and less import dependent over the next 10 years. Lahore and Karachi have had electricity since 1912 and 1913 respectively. Back then, electricity used to be produced in thermal plants by burning oil and coal. The real game changer for electricity generation in Pakistan came in the 1960s after the Indus Water Treaty and the building of the Terbela and Mangla dams. With these mega projects, the vast majority of Pakistan's electricity came from water until at least the early 1990s. However, over the next 2 decades, with the setting up of oil-fueled IPPs in the 1990s and the pivot towards natural gas during the Musharraf era, meant Pakistan's reliance on imported oil as a fuel for its electricity generation increased, and when Pakistan ran out of natural gas, the government had to import natural gas too. The PPP government between 2008 and 2013 was faced with an increased demand for oil that coincided with a sharp increase in oil prices. So, when Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif came into office in 2013, he knew he had one problem to solve: energy. The PMLN strategy was reliant on one big thing above all else: building lots and lots of power generation capacity. To do this, they offered overly generous contracts to private sector energy companies and agreed to allow the building of power plants that relied on imported coal, and also started ramping up LNG imports so that the thermal power plants that could no longer run on domestic gas could now run on imported gas rather than imported oil. In many ways, this strategy worked. Between 2013 and 2019, Pakistan's power generation capacity rose nearly 64% from 23,825 megawatts to 38,995 megawatts, according to NEPRA data. This became a classic Faustian bargain, a rapid increase in electricity generation capacity that is cheap for now but will likely start to get expensive later. As a result of the increased reliance on both imported coal and LNG, Pakistan now generates just over 52% of its electricity from purely domestic sources as of the fiscal year ending June 30, 2021. According to profit analysis of NEPRA data, this is down from over 84% in 2005 and 71% as recently as 2012. The stark decline in domestic energy sources make Pakistan more vulnerable to both changes in global energy prices as well as increases in the negative consequences of the government's poor decision-making on trying to control the currency exchange rate. Of course, the government could try not being stupid and when energy prices rise, simply pass them on to consumers. If the government can be patient for once, just one energy price cycle, and not panic and try to subsidize electricity unnecessarily, it will find itself with a problem that has fixed itself on the other side. Because a combination of energy policies of the past 4 administrations means that the next decade will see an additional 20,453 megawatts of power generation capacity come online in a mix that is both cleaner and less import dependent than the current mix. You see, the one good thing that the PPP-led Zardari administration did was to finalize a policy that allows for the construction of private sector hydroelectric power plants. The Nawaz and Imran Khan administration have started and continued the construction of the public sector Dasu Dam hydroelectric power project, and the Nawaz and Imran administration's facilitation of the third coal power projects mean that the domestic source of energy will finally start to contribute a meaningful percentage of the nation's electricity supply. Of that, 20,453 megawatts, over 10,600 megawatts are from hydroelectric power projects, the two biggest of which are the government's Dasu Dam and the fifth extension of the Terbela Dam. The remainder will come from smaller scale private sector hydroelectric power projects. Nearly 5,000 megawatts of coal-fired power projects will also come online over the next few years, which will change the makeup of the country's coal-fired power generation capacity. In short, if the government manages to not delay the construction of its hydroelectric power projects and does nothing that will prevent the private sector hydroelectric and coal power projects from reaching completion, the country will see its dependence on imported fuels decline and the proportion of clean energy in its overall power generation capacity rise, despite the increased coal-fired power generation. For that to happen, however, it is absolutely critical that the government not panic whenever global energy prices next start to rise. One can only hope they manage to hold their nerve.